Welcome, Will. All right, so with nobody else here, there won't be a privilege of the floor. So I'm going to move on to the NYSERDA webinar. Did any of you have a chance to look at any of that recording?
I didn't.
Okay, and that's fine because I'm going to summarize what I consider big points, and Will can help me. So I'm going to share. I nabbed a few slides from it. So let me see if I can share my screen. This one, and then let's see if I can do slideshow. All right. So hopefully you guys see a slide.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. So I just have like a handful of slides that they showed, and then a few comments from the Q&A that I was going to go through, and then anything else you guys want to add. So this is a map, as it shows, of energy deployment in New York. So this is where basically current and proposed battery energy storage, and actually, I'm not positive it's all battery. Well, a couple, there are like 2 pumped hydro projects in the New York. So, I mean, essentially all battery stuff, I assume. Mm-hmm. And, you know, the key thing for me in part is, you know, there's a lot down here, probably because of the huge energy needs of New York City. And so, you know, that stuff is there. This one right here, I assume, is that proposal for what's going to go take place at the old Keuga power plant. And later in some of the Q&A, they talked about how basically National Grid has some congestion issues, and that's why there's a bunch of, you know, likely to be some stuff out here. And then in some of this region here, the Adirondack Park has limitations, like I'm putting power lines and stuff in. So one of the likely solutions to some of their power issues is some additional battery energy storage. And I'm not sure if that's some of these are cropping up. So there's not a whole lot here in central New York, but in general, you know, they talk a lot about wanting to add these plants for grid reliability and, you know, peaking power and, you know, the ability to store renewable energy. And if solar farms are definitely coming in here, there's going to be more battery energy storage. So I think that this is definitely something that's, you know, while relatively uncommon in our area, is likely to become more common in the future. All right. Anybody want any questions about that map? I don't, you know, that's pretty much what I know. All right. Basically, so they had, well, one of the speakers was the guy who invented the lithium-ion battery. So no surprise he spent a lot of time talking about that, but also it is the battery being used right now. There's a few others, but they're not, you know, so, I mean, there's, you know, there's the traditional lead acid battery that we've had, and those are in use for various things. Like they're in your car because they have really high peak current capabilities. And I think utilities use them, like, you know, like telephone companies have them as their backup power and stuff like that. But as far as stuff being rolled out to really work on the grid, it's lithium ion. And this is kind of, you know, why. It's because, you know, basically they have a lot of energy per size. They're, compared to lead acid batteries, they are lower maintenance. We are now making tons of them. And because of that, the cost is dropping. And they're also lighter, so they are relatively portable, so that you actually can have these things in a trailer, basically, and have station at one place and then take it and move it somewhere else. So that was all the huge advantages of lithium ion, which is why that's dominating the market now. And when they talk to the guy in the Q&A, there are a couple other battery technologies, but I think that they're a decade out at least before they are likely to make much impact. So they from NYSERDA's perspective, this is the battery we're talking about, and you know, that's their perspective. I'm not up on everything.
So readily available. I might be misremembering this completely, but I thought I had heard a couple years back that that the lithium that gets used in those batteries comes from very few places, and so it's readily available if that's right, but not necessarily going to be enough to sustain worldwide development.
So someone asked that or a very similar question.
I sure did.
What will?
I've heard the same thing.
Yeah. So
I've been
someone made
told
that
the
question
same thing.
Okay, and that's possible. So someone asked that question in Q&A because of that, I think, concern. And what the guy there said was, yeah, I mean, it used to all be in this country. It was originally basically North Carolina, and then they discovered it in a solution, I guess, in basically, I don't know if it's Argentina or some other South American country. But he said in terms of total supply, there's plenty for, he says, the next decade. And at that point, we better start recycling the lithium that's been used. So that's his take on it, is that in terms of supply limitations, we have this problem with a number of things, right? Various things used in our electronic components have relatively small geographic sources. So it's not a new problem, but it isn't a concern. In terms of amount, he thinks we got plenty for the near future. And to make things continue, then we have to be figuring out a way to really recycle what we've withdrawn. So yes, I think that is a valid concern.
So that would be really important.
So on the research side, they're running supercomputers. Some of the research programs are to identify materials that are most likely to be workable for batteries. And once they identify the materials, they're spending the research money to figure out how the process to create the salts and to put the chemicals together. So they're already actively looking for better combinations. And most of the supply side concerns are focused on security, because most of the batteries are made outside the U.S.
So at any rate,
So, just saying.
Yeah, no, and so again, I think all these, are valid concerns about what's really going to happen to the industry. But for the foreseeable future, we're talking lithium-ion batteries, and that bottom line is probably correct. But yeah, if some either cartel takes over all the supply or whatever, the cost could go up, or it could be other issues. The other two things that the guy brought up is that indeed there has to be protection in terms of charging and discharging, right? I mean, like pretty much any rechargeable battery. And basically they made a big push that these things are actually quite safe, that there's a lot of new controls in place nowadays to, avoid fires and stuff like that. But we'll get to, that there's a whole next webinar on fire safety, but we'll get to some more of that, I think, in one of his next slides. And then basically, yeah, they can't run it at really hot temperatures or really cold temperatures. So, they like it kind of like we do, around room temperature, they're fine. I know from ones I've got, you're fine down to low, very low temperatures or moderately high. But these facilities are therefore air conditioned. And therein lies a concern, because those HVAC systems on huge buildings can be noisy. So from a land use perspective, from our thing, I think, having a noise limit, which we do in general, is going to be a reasonable concern. All right, just a picture.
Yeah, but also when you lose your air conditioning system, then what have you got left?
Yeah, at the very least, lower capacity and possible damage. And so that's a good point. I assume they have backup power for their air conditioning, but that's, yeah. Okay, so just a quick picture, that basically they're built up in units. So, a particular battery is a package shown on the left. They're packaged in units, and then those units are, packaged into towers. And then those towers get put in small buildings or crates. It's all modular. And then he gave a picture of various size systems. So, maybe you've heard of the Tesla wall battery. So that's, a residential size system, kilowatt hours, it's on the side of your wall. For longer power or for a small commercial facility, that's the sort of thing in the middle. And then what the utilities are really doing is the megawatt hour and gigawatt hour sort of facilities, which are, a set of buildings, basically, depending on how much they're gonna have to do. And again, compared to a solar farm, which might be, tens or hundreds of acres, even that, multi-megawatt facility there on the right, I assume that's like a couple of acres of disturbance. I'm not sure, but that's the sort of size we're typically talking about. So I understand it. But you can see those white boxes on top of the buildings, those are the HVAC units. And I assume over here in the middle one, the reason there's venting on either side is indeed those are probably cooling units. So there is definitely cooling needed. This question came up also in Q&A because, of course, batteries are often specified as kilowatt hours, megawatt hours, gigawatt hours, and then pretty soon you're going to start seeing them talking about megawatts and gigawatts. And so I think the gist of it is that typical, and Will can help chime in here, typical utility planning is for like a 4-hour outage. So when they say, oh, this is a 5 megawatt facility, basically it'll be designed with 20 megawatt hours worth of battery storage. But the megawatts is important to them because they need to know how much
Okay,
power.
so
Go ahead, Will.
the 4 hours is a function of the local markets, whatever markets, the commercial, wholesale markets, the owner wants to participate in because in most markets, they'll be supplying reserves or they'll bid in for particular hours. And they may, for some of those, they'll have a minimum bid time of 4 hours. It's more a function of your market. I don't know if New York has a minimum bid time, but they probably consider their peak to be 4 hours. I don't think they were really looking at outages.
Yeah, so thanks for that, because it wasn't clear at all why, say, 4 hours was the number picked, but that was typically utility planning, and indeed that kind of market minimum buy-in might be the sort of reason. But it was confusing to me why they were sometimes talking about peak power and sometimes by energy storage, because a battery stores energy. But again, from their end, it is important to know the peak power because the battery chemistry and the electronics have to be able to handle the peak power you want to put out. So they do, I guess, use both units when they're looking at the system. But at any rate, a lot of times in terms of the scale, it's usually how much total power they're storing. So it's going to be megawatt hours, gigawatt hours, that kind of thing. All right, so then I went through a lot of what he called fact versus fiction, and this is where, again, I'm just giving what he said. I have, a few concerns with some of these points. In particular, I think, Will picked up very well on, they're going to talk about how you can put them out with water, but that doesn't mean you have water to put them out with. So rural areas may have some different concerns. But, he said there's a concern that lithium-ion batteries don't last very long. I think that's based on consumer batteries that often last just a few years. And he said that's really a function of the quality of what goes into the construction, because they know you're going to throw your iPhone out after 3 or 4 years anyway, so don't bother to build it better. But I found a lifetime of 10 to 20 years actually pretty short. I wouldn't call that a long lifetime, but I admit it's comparable to lead acid batteries. So, what have you. I think that's kind of what it is.
My iPhone is probably 10 years old.
Yeah. And you don't have the capacity you once had in that thing, probably.
Mary Alice.
Yeah, and a lot of it is dependent on how you cycle the batteries. Yes. The more their lifetimes are really measured in cycles.
Right. So
it's how often you change, whether you're letting them out or building them up again, energizing or de-energizing.
And particularly for lithium ion, the depth of discharge has a big impact, and actually being fully charged isn't great for them either. So a lot of the facilities are designed to sort of go between 30% and 70% charge. But yes, they have to have electronics to prevent deep discharge and prevent overcharging. You're going to say about Mary Alice's phone, Jonathan?
Oh, just that it was failing. We both got them at the same time. Mine's fine still, probably not for long. And she can't get hers to charge anymore.
Yeah, and some of that will be how, again, the charging history of it, how many cycles it had to go through, whether you kept it really hot or cold, all that kind of stuff. All right, at any rate, as he said, you have to climate control where the batteries are. They have a whole session later on decommissioning and end of life. And so I think we'll learn more about recycling at that time. But I think that's obviously is important that these, once we're building a lot of these things, we have a way to dispose of them and reuse them in some way. And as their bottom point is, yeah, I mean, while right now they often tend to be big urban centers, that's not really where NYSERDA and other folks are looking for this. The utilities are looking them for resilience, grid stability, peaking power, all kinds of stuff. In the Q&A, they mentioned that, often it, like now there's some near New York City because economics say it's great because, power, the cost of power fluctuates. So when there's a lot of demand, they can throw in some battery power, get a lot of money for it, or they get paid for having the capacity there. So there's reasons why in tight markets, battery is much more economical right now, but it's going to be spread out all over the state. That's what I got away from that one.
But not to the same degree, because we have much smaller loads. Even once people switch to electric vehicles, we're still going to be a relatively small load here.
Yeah, and that came up in a separate way too, that right now, of course, the peak load tends to occur in the summer because of air conditioning. But as we continue to electrify heating systems, that picture may shift, and there may be a much bigger demand for electricity in the winter. So all these things, are relevant to battery power and whether solar can properly match up with the demand and all kind of stuff.
Yeah, plus if you're charging at night, that's not when your solar is charging your batteries. They're
Right.
charging during the day. It's actually very nice economics. But I noticed in the ORS queues that there's very little battery, very little megawatt hours of batteries. The only one I spotted was 3 megawatt hours for a 200 megawatt solar system. So the batteries the batteries are a really small part of the installation. So I'm thinking that's for some sort of station power function. So there's that.
Yeah, that makes sense. Because I would agree that probably in the future there might be a bigger rollout of battery storage to sort of shift that peak summer production to later times in the year or nighttime. But right now that doesn't seem what they're doing. They're just pumping the power into the grid, and I don't know if they're using it instantaneously. But okay, so basically the presenter was big on saying these things are really safe, because I think there's a big expectation they aren't safe. I think, he has a lot to be said for, the points that, yes, they have upgraded the code, as Will went through. The 2020 Uniform Fire Code has a lot of stuff for battery stuff, including monitoring and other stuff that is great. And again, there's a whole next webinar will be all about that. And the big thing, again, he pointed out, it was that, basically there's maybe a perception you can't put the fires out with water. You can, but as Will has pointed out, that also depends on having water available. And so I think it's probably reasonable in our law to have some requirement that there be adequate water available. They can't expect the fire departments in these rural areas to bring enough water on their trucks to put the fire out. Depending on the size of the facility, they have to make sure that the adequate materials are available for putting the fire out. So to me, that makes a lot of sense.
So here comes the weird part. The water, it isn't actually putting the fire out. It's cooling the battery to slow the chemical reaction that is causing the fire. And what's weird is most of the training right now is for putting out fires on electric vehicles. But on electric vehicles, the batteries are laid out horizontally. And as in the photo that you had earlier, most of the utility setups are vertical, they're on racks. So, what was suggested to me was that it's possible people may go to a nitrogen type system. We're still waiting to find out what kind of system they're recommending. So yes, you can put them out with water.
Who told you that?
Which part?
About the nitrogen.
Beth and Greg, they went to a training on putting out electric vehicle fires. And so when I mentioned the vertical racks, Beth was saying, well, maybe they'll be able to use nitrogen to cool. Not foam.
One second. Forgive my ignorance. So the people you mentioned, though, those are the local fire officials?
Slaterville Fire Department.
Okay, because that actually is another question I had, is they make a big point that, again, it says down here, fire responders are trained on a regular basis. That's down here at the bottom of the slide. And I was less clear whether our local volunteer fire departments were getting that kind of training. So I was hoping you might know the answer, because it does say at the very bottom, and I agree with this, it should be in the law, that system-specific training and incident response plans should also be provided by project developers. So they need to provide the training for our volunteer fire departments. But do you think they're getting much training at all right now in putting out battery fires?
So this is what I understood from what they said. They're getting training about electric vehicles. And of course, that's a different animal because a lot of the electric vehicle fires are caused by crashes because
hold on one second.
Piercing the battery often.
What? Okay, it just wasn't to me. Okay. Oh. Sorry, I'm back.
Yeah, piercing a battery often starts a fire. And so the whole phenomenon of a vehicle catching on fire is more often related to crashing into things. And for these utility installations, they're not, unless a tree falls on the container, it would have to be a really big tree, or a tornado comes along. I don't think you have to worry about it. It's more a temperature concern. So their strategies are very different. With the cars, their strategy is to get people out of the car, which is tricky.
Will, can you hold on
and then
to? Okay, go ahead, Catherine. And I don't want to get into the car thing. I don't want to go down to the car stuff because that's not what we're going to be talking about. So we're going to move on. But Catherine had a question, I think. So.
Well, I guess just a comment in the spirit of, I think, moving this forward. If there are areas of confusion or things that need to be clarified, I would maybe just motion to bring that to the board and put that on the agenda and have the relevant people present, whether that's fire or whatever, or have a special meeting about it. But I just would like, I don't think we need to do this.
And again, electric vehicles are not my concern. We're putting a law together. I think that getting input from the fire chiefs would be good. And the whole next webinar is on fire stuff. So Will, I'm thinking you're probably attending that, though you've gone through a lot of the fire code yourself already, and can ask some of these questions, of them at that webinar. If you have resolved, questions you're wondering about. I think we're going to move on to the next set of stuff.
Well, they said that NYSEG usually provides training for equipment that NYSEG installs, which is really important information because the fire code excludes projects that are under the exclusive control of NYSEG.
Okay.
And
Okay.
this fire code that they follow is about to be released, and it's not worth it to go look at the previous fire code
Yeah. Again,
because they're about to release new fire code, and it's been changing too fast.
Right. I think we're getting down
they're
in the
not
weeds
gonna
that we
know
can't do in this meeting right now. So let's move on. So the one of the presenters talked a bit about general environmental concerns. And one thing I found interesting that they mentioned is this point about the second bullet point, that like many other fires, you may need to implement fire water collection strategies, because that was always my concern or question. And so I think something we can think about having in our law. And also, as a more general point, if we had other facilities with hazardous or toxic chemicals on them and there's a fire and you're putting it out, I would want, that should be contained as well. So I thought that was interesting that they had brought that point up. They do mention that, lithium ion batteries don't off-gas stuff, so that's good. And they produce excess noise, but again, it is the HVAC system, so and any inverters. So I think, again, noise is definitely something to pay attention to. It's not huge noise. It's not like, boom and bang, but it's definitely noise in the environment that needs to be mitigated or kept to a minimum. And I think, okay, great. That was the end of their slides. And all I wanted to mention, I think most of the stuff that came up in Q&A, I think I've now talked about. I'm going to stop, unless someone wants to see one of those slides again, I'm going to stop the screen share. All right, so let's see. Yeah, the water collection. Yeah, okay, so one of the new battery technologies is a solid state battery, but he definitely said right now they only work up about 70 degrees centigrade, so that's pretty hot, and not really there for general use, but maybe 10 or so years from now. And yeah, the systems are monitored for producing gases, for temperature, for all these failures, and yeah, so that's most of the stuff that came up in Q&A that I didn't already talk about. So yeah, I mean, so it was moderately useful, more for I didn't know that much other than what Will had dived in deep. So Will, it might have been less certainly new material for you. But I'm quite curious what they're going to talk about. It'd be interesting to see what they have at the fire safety webinar. And then the other one I had mentioned, there's a decommissioning end of life webinar. There's one on essentially, planning and zoning and stuff. And, they've got the model law there. They've got a model permit. I'm not planning to necessarily go to that other webinar, but any of them are up for grabs. All right, any other comments? Quick comments, Will, based on that webinar, because then I want to move on to looking at the model law for a little while.
I spent quite a bit of time talking to Greg and Beth, and I put in a call to Chris Jordan if you want to talk to them. I'm sorry, I just have to think a minute. They made a point of asking about what chemicals are released during a fire, and pointed out that you might want to require what's called diking, where you build a kind of moat to contain the water if they think they'll be putting out the fire with water.
Yeah, I think that was what they mentioned, I think, about fire, handling the water. And I think that's a good idea, or something like that. Again, I don't know enough, and I want to get feedback from the fire people, but it sounds like they agree it might be a good one, a good idea.
Did they mention that once you have a fire, and I realize they don't think that it's likely, but once you have a fire, it's not just a matter of extinguishing it You have to keep checking on it. Afterwards, it could reignite days later.
They didn't talk about that, but again, they kept saying, and we'll talk more about this at the next webinar. So that may be the sort of thing. And again, if you're on that one, you know, there's a way to enter questions. And so if they don't cover that kind of thing, and that's the sort of thing you can make sure that they address or treat. Okay, so I have not had a chance to look at the model law. Not that I looked at the model law. I haven't had a chance to look at the laws from other towns yet. I don't know if anybody else has. And as I sort of wrote, we can sort of maybe put that off. It's been a busy week, I'm sure, for everybody. But I did go through the model law a bit, and I do have a little bit extracted from the site plan review law to look at as a group. So I thought we'd move on to that part of the agenda if everyone else is amenable. All right. So now we're going to share. All right. So let me put this something bigger. Why is it not? Well, let's type it. Is that big enough for you guys to read?
Yeah, for me.
All right. Not what I can do. Okay, so so basically the model law is pretty much written assuming you've got zoning. So I highlighted the word zoning provisions, and it appears throughout the thing. And some of it will have to change because of the lack of zoning that we currently have. And particularly the authority, you know, will be totally different. But, you know, the town attorney will put that in just like we did in the other law. You know, statement of purpose is kind of, you know, the normal sort of, you know, justification for why these sort of things are good, that we're trying to allow them to happen, but happen safely. There's a whole series of definitions, which, you know, you should probably read through. At some point, I tagged a few. So one thing, okay, so the battery energy storage system, they have two size classes. Remember, we went up with 3 for our solar law. And basically their cutoff is 600 kilowatt hours, which is something Will had brought up in some previous stuff to us. And so, I don't know what the level should be. Maybe that's fine. That's a lot bigger than the system I've got to power my house, but that might be good because this would cover, say, a small commercial facility. And again, the idea is similar to the unified solar permit, that basically you would have just a simple permit application, because this system is small enough, presumably not to cause a significant issue. It will still have fire code. There's still stuff in the fire code that would treat and address a 600 kilowatt and lower kilowatt hour and lower system. But that with at the town level, you just have a simple checkoff form with a few things that, and we have that sample permit, and we can make sure we think it's adequate. But at any rate, so that again streamlines it. So if, a resident or a small business wants to throw something in their back room, that it's possible to do without a big hassle. Larger facilities then would be like our large solar facilities get a review by the site plan review board. And so that's their tier 2 here. So again, one question is whether this is the right number for us or not. I think Will's indication. Will you agree that that's a reasonable number? You're muted if you're trying to say anything.
The 600?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's okay.
Okay. Let's see. So
the thing is, Bill, it'll be the thing is, the 600 is not. It's not going to match the changes in requirements under the building permit. I don't think for our purposes that matters, but I'm just mentioning that it's not a straightforward correspondence. And the fire code really has a lot of details.
Yes. Good. I know you looked at them. I know I haven't. Okay, so, and that it dovetails right with what I said under commissioning. They mentioned the commissioning process has to demonstrate that the system complies with applicable code requirements, which is indeed all that extensive stuff that is now in the state uniform fire code. You know, since these things can be in a building, I thought it was interesting that basically the building isn't supposed to have people in it much, but they can basically have an office. And then they just make sure that if you have some office or place, what I put in yellow is that basically people have to be able to get out without going near the batteries, which I thought was a reasonable provision. Because, you know, if there is an emergency, you don't want to have to exit via the emergency. Other stuff here. Okay, so yeah, again, there's all these definitions that are pretty much boilerplate. I thought it was, you know, again, standard applicability stuff that, you know, if something new is being built, this applies. If it's already there, it doesn't apply. But if you modify or retrofit it, then you've got to be subject to this law. So pretty standard local law language there. General requirements, there's nothing I thought was particularly interesting, I guess. I mean, it just says it has to apply
So
to
the
all.
thing about the thing about having a dedicated building and having access, you know, ability to get in and out, there's an approval clause on that, and it doesn't really it say who has to approve it. So you might want to consider putting that in our local law, who has to approve the ability to get in and out. You know, probably the fire official should approve it, even though it's not explicit in the code.
Okay. Let's see if we make that. We'll just leave it there. I'll highlight it later. All right, again, it just says it has to apply to all codes. And of course it has to anyway, but laws often seem to say this sort of stuff, like you have to obey laws. So, so there it is. And so then here are some of the meat of the law. So basically the small systems just, again, it says all zoning districts. Again, that's not relevant to us, but you know, that they just fill out this permit and exempt from site plan review. Now in our case, we usually specify that the permit is, of course, goes to the code officer and has to be approved or whatever. Then the larger systems, again, it's typically set up that you would restrict which zoning districts a large system could be in. Again, currently not an option for Caroline. And then a lot of process and stuff is spelled out that we could or would change, because a lot of that process is the process already in our site plan review law. So like we did in the solar law, it would be more a matter of saying, here's what you have to do in addition to what's in the site plan review law. Because I wouldn't want to write something that inadvertently conflicted with what that law said. That just gets everybody confused and also leads to an unnecessarily long law. So there may be some things here, but this would be, again, I've made a quick read through, but everyone should look through it more carefully. But it talks about, you know, a public hearing. Again, the public hearing process is all spelled out in the site plan review law. And as well as utilities looking at stuff is in the site plan review law. There may not be anything on signage in the existing site plan review law. There's not much. In the new revised law that might get passed, there is some stuff on signs. But this is also important because these has to do with more like you want signs to know who to contact in an emergency. Whereas the site plan review law is going to be more like, oh, you want to put a sign in front of your business, it can't be more than this big or that big. So I think, you know, keeping, like we did in the solar law, something about what has to be on the signs would be important. Again, the lighting in our site plan review law, this section is weak. Go ahead, Will.
Okay, so that was another thing that Beth and Greg pointed out. They said that one of the difficulties the firefighters are having is that the signage that identifies what type of technology is being used isn't necessarily completely set up yet. And so we may need to look at that in more detail.
Okay, all right, that's what I've tried to do, but
Also,
go ahead.
Um, the code officer needs to tell the firefighters, the fire department, about each installation. They should have already been doing that for the solar installations, and they haven't been. And they should be doing it for if we were to get battery storage also.
So,
So mhm.
So I don't think it's right now, the way the site plan review law is written, as part of the site plan review, the part of the review is that the emergency services are notified. So that provision is in our existing site plan review law. It's supposed to go by the fire officials.
Okay. Okay, but there's, they also suggested that the code officer who is in our town, the fire official, should be required to take the training also.
Yeah, it's probably a good idea. Okay, there are things that talk about the lighting and noise. And again, we would want to compare those things to what we put in the solar law and what's in site plan review law. The lighting section in the existing law is old. The lighting section in the revised site plan review law is minimal, and what we put in the solar law is probably the best thing. And but at any rate, and some of the noise limit here is not necessarily will be up for discussion. But I was pointing out that there is a noise section in the law, and I said check it against what we had. And then there's a big section on decommissioning. Again, I have nothing particular to say. I think it's we would need to look it over and carefully and look at compared to what we had for decommissioning solar stuff. And after we go through the decommissioning, if we listen to the decommissioning webinar, we may have other ideas. Though again, what they're going to talk about is likely going to follow exactly what they have here, because it's all NYSERDA based. But talk about decommissioning fund. Again, we have somewhat more robust language in our solar law on the escrow fund, and so that could be transported into here. And then the site plan application, again, all this stuff, most of the stuff is spelled out in our existing site plan review law. So we wouldn't have to respell it out here. Other than I think the analytical diagram is probably not in the site plan review law. The commissioning plan.
Okay, could you scroll back up a page back where?
Absolutely. To how far up?
The section on vegetation management.
Yeah, yes, here we go. Yes.
So yeah, I just when I first read this is one of the few things that really caught my eye. I was like, what? We're gonna have trees 10 feet away from this battery storage? Isn't that a little iffy? And then I started thinking, well, they overheat, and being shaded by trees might be really great. And there's all this stuff in other places about screening required and trees, but that installation that you showed us from this slideshow was just a bare hilltop with nothing on it, and there they are.
Yeah.
So I'm just sort of wondering where that
but
be.
Then the 10 feet is from the fire code to keep it away from the venting. That's the point.
Uh-huh.
Yes, these
They
facilities
don't
have.
want you to block the. Yeah, they have venting.
Mhm.
So yeah, so I mean, and good question, and I think that, and I noticed there was language similar to this in the Lansing law, so it probably also came from the fire code. Again, I don't know what the right number is, but a certain amount of shading of the building to keep it cool is probably all to the good. A certain amount of obscuring of the, industrial outline is probably good. On the other hand, you wouldn't want to start, luckily we're not typically in drought conditions, but yeah, so I'm assuming, so if it's 10 feet is for the venting, that makes sense. But yeah, how close should stuff be to avoid fire hazard? Again, it's not like these things catch fire every day. So it'll be interesting to see what they say at the fire thing. Maybe they'll go into vegetation stuff. And it basically says that do not form a means of readily transmitting fire. You can have stuff even closer than 10 feet. I'm not sure what that means in terms of, you know, the plant, but. All right, so there, you know, decommissioning is obviously required, and that I think again bears some careful looking through. And then the application can be shortened a lot based on there's already stuff in our site plan review law, is my take on this. Yeah, there's a fire safety compliance plan. And I thought it was interesting, there's an operation maintenance manual, and which I thought was kind of cool that it has to describe, you know, basically what they're going to do to upkeep the batteries in the facility, and how they're going to make sure they meet the uniform code requirements. So again, stuff like erosion sediment control, that's in our site plan review law. And this was, I think we should have put something.
It should be an emergency.
Yeah, and here it is. So here's the
There
emergency
should be
operations
an
plan.
emergency cleanup. Yeah,
So yeah, so this is the operation plan. The emergency operations plan does have some information on, you know, how you do a safe shutdown, de-energize, isolate, etc. Inspection, what you do, you know, after it happens, what the procedures are that are to be followed in case of, you know, these things. And, you know, it doesn't say, but so there is going to be a plan. I assume they submit that plan to the review board, and that I guess would ideally be disseminated to the emergency, you know, personnel, the fire departments. And then procedures and schedules for conducting drills. Special use permit standards.
so
Again, go ahead.
when you consider the decommissioning plan, you know, in there, it's worth noting that should include cleanup after an incident.
Okay, so yeah, so I don't think that's under decommission, because that would be like when you are done, but you're right, there needs to be something which maybe would be under emergency operations plan, which is, you know, clean up after the emergency is over. So we'll just, and I'm not sure, but that's just a quick thought that maybe that's where it should go.
I think there was a procedure for safe restart listed somewhere in there. For
Okay,
restarting so maybe that would be one place where, you know, clean up and safely.
let me go back and look for that. Yeah, I'll go look for that at some point.
Okay.
Again, we don't really have special use permits because of how we don't have zoning, but basically, you know, we'll have standards, design standards or something. And, you know, so we should look at these. They do require fences. It's interesting to me so I believe that the large solar facilities will tend to have fences because indeed the electrical code requires it, and maybe electrical code requires it for a large battery storage, or the uniform fire code. I'm not sure which might. So it might be that they are required regardless, but this law certainly requires them. Yes, Will, what?
Yeah, that's exactly it.
Okay. And then this ownership changes is, I think it must have been what you found at one time, Will, because it reads fairly spaced. And our attorney has written a somewhat more robust set of these for our solar law, and so we could do something similar. And then let's see, yes. So right, talking about certification to various standards. So they talked about site access shall be maintained, including snow removal at a level acceptable to local fire department. So this could be where we throw in something about making sure that the fire departments are basically happy with the access, but that they have 2 avenues of access. You know, in case the one gets blocked, that they could reach the facility. Okay. And again, all the special permit stuff changes. And this thing about being valid for a period of 24 months. Yeah, I don't know. I think that means you have to basically get it done in that time, but I haven't read this carefully enough to know what they're going at with the 24-month period.
Either done or they say substantial construction, you know, so you can't
Yeah.
just have sort of put a few flags in the ground. If you're halfway
Yeah,
through building, actively doing it, I think it would be okay.
yeah. I mean, this probably is gone because again, we don't really have special use permits in the town, but they get site plan approval and then they go ahead. And I don't know if there's anything in our law that says you got to start within a certain amount of time from when you get your site plan approval. That's an aspect of the site plan review law I don't recall. I'm gonna just put that as a question to.
I don't remember it that either, Bill. I don't know that there is a time. We can confirm, of course, but I don't think there is a time limit.
Okay, yeah, we should.
Yeah,
And
so
after that,
it's
it's all
last
boilerplate.
line, just above what you were writing.
Yeah.
What?
If the owner operator fails to perform substantial construction, yeah. Okay, so that's sort
Yeah.
of, I guess, talking about what you were getting at. Yeah.
Right,
Yeah,
that it's-
basically,
it isn't necessarily saying that they have to be up and running.
right. They have
They
to
just
have to done,
be
right.
clearly building.
And the rest of this is boilerplate stuff. So one way we could go, and at this point, I guess this is feeling fairly likely and easier, is to take this model law and adapt it for our town with some of the additions, and particularly like, making sure that there is, at whatever is being used to fight the fire, that there's enough of it on hand, whether that's water or something else. And that, there isn't an environmental discharge of toxic something in fighting an emergency. And the other stuff that we talked about at the last meeting. And again, I think it could be shortened considerably because of duplications with the site plan review law. So I'm moderately happy with this law. What are you guys, again, it's rough. It needs a bunch of Caroline, work, but what is the basic feeling of the rest of the planning board?
As a starting point at least. And covering a lot of bases. So there's structure there to work with.
And we do have those other laws that some of the towns have passed, and I suggest that we could either divvy those up or otherwise look at those between now and the next meeting, because again, that's a good way to say, oh, here's something somebody else thought of that we didn't. And so I'm happy if either one of you want to volunteer to say, I'll do this one and this one, or we can all sort of look at all of them. How do you guys want to deal with that work?
I thought one
That
of them
sounds
looked
good. I think
very
that might
similar
be
to our solar siting plan.
Again, I haven't looked at them, so I don't know. So you've looked at some of them, Will? And Jonathan, you've disappeared on us.
Yeah, one of them I didn't think was very useful. In a minute, I can tell you which one. The first one, the longer one was actually useful. I'm pulling it up.
Bill, I'm still here. I just, my internet connection is being very flaky, so I thought getting rid of my video would help.
Yep, no worries.
The town of Greenberg.
That was useful, you said? Or is that the
Yeah, but it
unuseful one?
looked a lot like it was useful, but it looked a lot like our solar siting plan, our solar siting law. Like basically, I think they did. I didn't see much difference, and they repeated things that we opted not to spell out in there because the information occurred elsewhere, like in the fire code or in the uniform code. But yeah, I think your idea is good. They went with more than, I think they went with 3 tiers though.
Okay. All right, well, I guess, okay, so I will go ahead and certainly look through the laws. Jonathan, if you've got time, look at a couple of them, 2 or 3 of them as well. It sounds like Will already has, and then we can all tackle this law with more expert eyes. Okay, I'm gonna open a different document. That one, okay. So are you still seeing? I don't know how the sharing, okay, I'm gonna stop my sharing first. And now restart screen sharing with, there. Okay, and then again, I have to. All right. All right, so you should now be seeing something that says like triggers near the top. Is that right?
Yeah.
All right, great. Okay, so the first thing is just comments I said, which is I didn't see any specific conditions related to fire protection in general, or about, hazardous material stuff in regards to fires. And the reason I note that is that, one, we're, I think, identifying some things in our work on the solar law and on the battery storage law that really are more generally applicable to the town. From the solar end, it's like anything that disturbs, 20, 40, 60, 100 acres of land probably ought to have some of the similar requirements put on it that we put on the solar facilities. And here, anything that poses some extra hazards because of the, toxic chemicals or whatever, should probably have some extra conditions. So that's why I made that comment there. And what I've excerpted here comes from the existing site plan review law, but my note here was to myself was that basically I didn't say anything in the proposed revisions that changes any of this. So the first thing to point out is that there are triggers for what gets site plan review, and here are the 3 most relevant ones. So basically heavy or light industrial uses, I have those definitions down below. Light industrial uses only if they have enough area, square footage. And then any development activity involving, hazardous materials. And then hazardous materials is defined later on in the thing. So we probably would want to add a trigger that basically said battery energy storage systems. It's not clear if it would fall under one of these things. I've copied the definitions, but they're long enough. I don't want to read the definitions as a group. But I don't know for sure that a battery energy storage system would get captured by these triggers. It probably would, but there's no harm in specifying that it does. But indeed, we already say that there should be a site plan review for anything that has hazardous materials. So it wouldn't be a big stretch to add stuff to it that says, so things that have hazardous materials have to have these extra fire safety precautions too. Just like we're adding for battery stuff.
Yeah, right. Yeah, but what gets weird is where are you getting your hazardous materials definition from? Because if you go to the fire code, then it's not a good match. You'd have to come up with your own definition from somewhere.
Yeah, so this one is, so hazardous materials was defined in the law, and that I think is a definition I did in the site plan review law, and I did not bother to copy that because it was also quite long. And my recollection, because I read it this afternoon, is basically it said, if it's hazardous materials according to this definition, which is like a federal designation, that's hazardous. But on top of that, basically, if it's a bad thing, it's a hazardous material for Caroline. I mean, I obviously grossly simplify, but it basically says any material that would be detrimental to human health, or something like that. And so we should look at that definition, but maybe next time. I did not copy and paste it in here, I don't think. I got the industrial use heavy, which is, it goes on quite a bit. Yeah, no. So I did not put in that definition, which I agree is key. So we should probably look at that. And again, I actually don't want to go through these definitions unless one of you really wants to. But the heavy industrial use, you know, if you're doing chemical transformation of materials into new products, again, that would not be a battery facility. So I have not read these carefully enough to know if they'd apply to a battery facility. And I guess the only other things I wanted to point out that are in the law, there's a whole list of site plan considerations, and two of them seem sort of relevant. It says adequacy of water supply and sewage and waste disposal facilities. So what they really mean there, of course, is that there's enough water, because they're thinking of like an apartment building, right? Or a commercial building. You want to have enough water supply to service the needs. I don't know if one could bend that to say that it means you have to have enough water supply to put out a fire, for example. So I expect that might be a little bit of a stretch. So we should really add a provision, you know, that specifies that. I'm not sure the existing stuff covers that well enough. It does call out adequacy of fire lanes and other emergency zones. That could cover adequacy of fire lanes that the fire people are confident that they can get in there by one or another means. So maybe we don't have to specify something in addition, but it might be important to call their attention to the fact that, hey, what if this one avenue is blocked? You ought to have two avenues. Again, yeah, just water supply has to be adequate for the proposed uses. We have to have under transportation, it has to provide for emergency service vehicles. That often just means the road has to be wide enough for them. It doesn't necessarily specify that, hey, if the fire blocks this way in, you have to have a second way in. And here's, Will, the thing that basically appropriate fire department and provider should be provided plans. That's under this public. So in other words, the site plan goes to all these emergency service providers, and they're supposed to, I guess, review it. And I think that's the end of my notes. So there's not a lot in the law that directly addresses something like a battery energy facility, or, you know, again, an agricultural facility that had a lot of hazardous chemicals on it is reviewed, but there's not much that specifically says, and in the site plan, in the review board's review, they should make sure of X, Y, and Z. So we may want to provide some language of things that we want to make sure the review board uses when evaluating these kind of facilities. So that's my take.
So the thing is, it's saying that they should be shown the plan, but it's not like a final. There's nothing final about that. Shouldn't they really be given the information when, like, details when the permit is issued? Isn't that the appropriate time when everything is finalized?
Okay. Right, 'cause I think the intention is that the emergency services personnel provide input into the site plan review process. And that is why this is worded this way. But I think you are, I think, raising a point that, you know, when it's all said and done, and maybe or maybe not the applicant decide to take the advice of the emergency service personnel, that when we're all said and done, do the emergency personnel know what's there and what to do? Okay, we'll make sure that gets in there somewhere. Any other comments from somebody? Okay, cool. So where I suggest we go from here is that we need to take a look at those other model laws. And figure out what we want to perhaps add to this model law. I'm not going to go real far in working on the model law till I've listened to the webinar on fire code safety and on decommissioning. I recommend we hold off on those sections till we get a little bit more informed. But I think we have the basics there in that model law, and what Will has delved into the fire code and discovered.
So Bill, I don't know what they mean when they tell you that there aren't gases given off, or is that what they told you? Because in the fire code, they talk about deflagration venting.
Right. So I think that's a good point. So I heard that in the thing that there 2 points were made. One is so backing up slightly. So lead acid batteries, particularly when they're charging recharge, can give off hydrogen gas. And so I think that's they're saying, lithium ion batteries don't do that. But I think there must be certain cases, perhaps if they overheat or otherwise, that they do exude some gases. Because indeed, as part of the Uniform Fire Code safety precautions, they have to have venting stuff in place and stuff that monitors, and then the whole point they said is why these things don't explode is that the facilities are designed to vent any explosive gases. So yeah, so I'm assuming that there is some failure modes in which there are some gases emitted, and that's what that stuff is for. Whereas in normal charging, recharging, lead acid batteries can emit hydrogen. So I'm thinking that's the distinction, but they did slough over that a bit in the presentation.
Yeah, and I think it requires that level of clarity I think it's important.
Okay, well, we'll have the opportunity to ask that question next Wednesday, I think. Okay. So it seems to me, see what you guys think, that we've got, enough to work on in terms of this law. There's going to be this month, we'll get through a couple of the webinars, some more time. So, in another month or two, we would be completed with this battery energy storage law. And that would kind of complete the set of stuff that we sort of started basically last December. And then it'll be time to sort of think about new projects. So, at 6:45, I'm not wanting to launch into that discussion, but I'm suggesting, everybody think about that. Review the comp plan, whatever your own personal predictions are. Catherine, is a good opportunity for you to go to the town board and get some feedback for us on directions the town board might most want us to take next.
In terms of, can you clarify what the ask is?
The ask is, what would the town board like the planning board to do next?
Oh, like when this is all done, you mean?
Yeah. I'm anticipating that we'll be all done with the battery law in a couple of months, like 2 more meetings. And I could be, of course, optimistic on that score. It depends a bit how much drafting gets done, beforehand and stuff. But, I think we'll be very close to there in a couple more meetings. And so then I'd like to, I've been pushing a certain agenda for, again, a year and a half between the comp plan and this stuff. I think it's time to open that up and figure out, things that the town board wants us to do, stuff other committee members want us to do, what we think the town wants us to do.
Right. I mean, certainly I'll bring this to the board, but my assumption and my personal bias is that we're going to be dealing with zoning and land use regulation as a primary initiative for a while. And so I think I don't know that the planning board needs something new in addition to that. I think that it really would be prudent to, there's gonna be plenty to do there from community education to, you know, public meetings to distribution of material, you know, like, I mean, there's 100 different things that I think.
Right. Okay, well, yeah, why don't you guys have a chat about that, because, you know, there's a division, I mean, as you at one point had lobbied, you know, the three of us could join the zoning commission.
Yep.
I'm thinking there may be other things for us to do while the zoning commission sort of grinds away at its work, that they don't necessarily need extra hands, but maybe they do. So that's, I think, a good thing for the town board to discuss.
Well, yeah, so we can discuss it, and I guess I would maybe think about you guys thinking on and discussing how you feel about the efficacy and practicality of working on things with 3 people.
Yeah.
Because, you know, I guess I'm still lobbying for everyone to be working in service to the primary goal, which is getting this preliminary zoning work done, especially since we're going to be dealing with this extension of a moratorium. So I don't think we're going to want 4 extensions.
Yeah, no, in particular, if there were things, yeah, I don't know. Well, we'll get there. If there were things that we could sort of work on, like offload from the zoning commission, that could be sort of given to the 3 of us to do, that'd be one thing, that we continue meeting as a separate committee, as opposed to becoming part of what would then be a 10-person committee. I don't know the most efficacious way forward.
Okay. Yeah, I'll bring that. I'll definitely bring that.
Okay, cool. Alrighty, right. Anybody else have anything else, an announcement or anything else they want to bring forward?
Nope.
Okay, then
Okay.
let's adjourn and enjoy a little bit of the last bit of sunshine in the day.